Good afternoon. Welcome to the October 2020 webinar of the Ecological Law and Governance Association's monthly webinar series. Today's webinar is on the topic Identity, Equity, Law, and Law in Ecological Worldmaking. It's hosted by the Anthropocene to the Ecozoic initiative, known as A2E, which merges the economics for the Anthropocene and leadership for the Ecozoic initiatives, which have been an evolving partnership of McGill University, the University of Vermont, and York University since 2014. My name is Geoff Garver. I'm on the steering committee of ELGA, and I coordinate law and governance research with A2E, and I will be moderating today's webinar. So looking at how ecological law intersects with questions of power, race, identity, and equity could not be more timely, given the resonance of the Black Lives Matter movement and the inequities and justice issues that the COVID pandemic is exposing as it hits Black, Indigenous, and people of color, especially hard in many parts of the world. And sadly, we are witnessing tragic events this week in Nigeria around the ongoing struggle against police violence there. But this topic was already on ELGA's radar screen when we started planning our 2020 series about a year ago. Justice is an essential element of ecological law, both in how ecological law must build in principles and approaches that ensure environmental and ecological justice, and in how ecological law is developed. Last night, PBS in the US broadcast a documentary narrated by Jelani Cobb called Whose Vote Counts, which looked at voter suppression that targets many of the same communities affected by environmental racism. And similarly, one question for today's webinar is whose voice counts in the co-creation of ecological law? Is ecological law being developed in a space where everyone who matters is empowered and welcome to participate? Is there a danger of it evolving as yet another white space with Black faces? What's our homework on all this? I borrow the concept of white space and Black faces from Dr. Carolyn Finney, who has been helping the A2E community work through some challenging issues of race, identity, and equity, both in how A2E functions as a community and in the work it produces. And I'm going to borrow from her again by making clear, as she did with A2E, that we are not going to solve anything in today's webinar. What I hope we are going to do today is move forward by having an open and organic dialogue about the vision and fight for a more ecologically viable and more just world. How can ecological law contribute to the forging of anti-racist, feminist, and decolonial environmentalism and act in the service of justice? How can relations of trust, accountability, and solidarity be built and maintained? And how can ongoing scholarship and movement organizing around racial injustice and environmental racism inform the conversation about ecological law? We will start with some opening thoughts on these questions from four people who have spent a lot of time engaging with them as researchers, educators, and/or activists. Then we'll have our panelists respond to what they've heard from their fellow panelists, and then we'll bring in voices from those of you tuning into today's webinar. Please feel free to write your comments or questions in the chat at any point, and we will raise as many as we can before the end of this session. So with that introduction, I'd like to turn things over to our first panelist, Kesha Fevrier. Kesha is a recent PhD graduate of York University's Faculty of Environmental Studies.
So hi, everyone. Can everybody hear me? Okay. So I come to this discussion not with any answers, but with many questions. I come to this discussion from the standpoint of research in environmental racism and injustice, and also the broader issue of global inequities, which is itself a manifestation of how race is spatialized and how spaces are racialized. So when I think, when Geoff told me about this talk, he sent out this Oslo manifesto. And there are two things that I want to read, two statements. So from this manifesto, I just extracted this statement. It says, Ecological law requires that human activities and aspirations be determined by the need to protect the integrity of ecological systems. Ecological integrity becomes a precondition for human aspirations and a fundamental principle of law. Now, that is an extract from the Oslo Manifesto. And a few weeks before I defended, I attended a Zoom talk by Professor Achille Bembe. And in his talk, he made this statement, and it's a statement to get us thinking. Racism is a huge ecological question. Ecological questions are, to a large extent, questions of racism. So I'm going to leave these two different statements in the air for people to ponder about from two different perspectives. And now I'm going to talk about my research. My research focuses on informal waste recycling. I did my research in the West African country of Ghana, where electronic waste, both what is locally produced and what is imported, is predominantly recycled in the informal sector. Now, this whole issue came to light because of organizations like Greenpeace and the Basel Action Network. And in the very beginning, in the early stages of research, everything was focused around the environmental harms caused by this informal recycling activity. So the reports talked about it being one of the 10, I think, don't quote me on it, but one of the most polluted sites in the world. And you have all these pictures showing sort of the degradation of the natural environment, from the water to soil to air, everything. So all the very first trunk of research was all about concerns for the environment. Forward a few months or a few years, you have a business case approach is starting to gain traction. And this business case approach is pulling on research in circular economies and green capitalism. And recycling is at the center of that discussion. So you have a movement where in the very first instance, we're talking about environmental contamination. And now we're trying to change that focus and not so much talk about environmental contamination, but talk about how economically feasible this activity is for these spaces. And there's a general discussion of it described as waste-dependent development. So you send waste to countries in the global south and even to racialized spaces in the global north, where it is recycled or dealt with by racialized beings, migrants, the urban poor, etc. And I say this because we tend to think about this informal waste recycling in West Africa, in Pakistan, along the Israeli-Palestinian border, in Brazil, but it also happens in Italy. It also happens in the US prison system. So it is not just focused in the global south. And you have this agenda to make or to transform the livelihood strategies of the urban poor, of the racialized, as a business strategy, as something that is sustainable, as something that fits into the discourse of the circular economy, as something that is sustainable. And my question here, and this whole interest in ecological law is, how does how if we are co-creating this law, how does it deal with this sort of conceptualization? How something that was once seen as an environmental harm could be redressed as something that is sustainable, even as it occurs and it continues to harm the environment. It continues to harm the bodies of those people involved in it. And so my question is, when I hear circular economy and I hear green capitalism, I see it as an, what you call that, the emperor's new clothes? A continuation of the same, where the same racialized beings are disproportionately burdened with toxic waste. And so I am talking about my research to get us thinking that this sort of co-creation of an ecological law, it should not replicate the systems that already exist and that continue to oppress certain people and certain spaces. So I don't know if I went over my 10 minutes or if I haven't even reached it, but these are the things I want us to think about while we have this discussion, and use sort of my research experience as a sort of a springboard to think about, given the inequalities and the differences in places and spaces, how do we co-create this law that it functions for everyone? Is it even possible? Is it a utopian idea or an ideal? And I just think, before I close, that when we're going forward with this, it shouldn't follow the step of discussions about environmentalism, which has had a very racist history. It has been very exclusionary. So do we talk about co-creation in a genuine way, where it's not about tokenism, where it's not about co-opting the knowledge of indigenous peoples or peoples of color and reframing it and then selling it back to them? What exactly do we mean by co-creation, and who is really at the table? Because in my research, some of the solutions to the way e-waste was being recycled was always top down. The people that were involved were never directly involved, were never at the table talking about how can we improve this. So again, it is, how do we bring more people at the table, the people who are directly involved, the people who feel it, the people who know it, the people who do it, so that the solution is not prescriptive and it's not top down and it's not by us for you. I think I will stop here. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Kesha, for a really great start, raising some very, very good issues. Jen is next. Jen Gobby is an activist, scholar, and postdoc researcher at Concordia University. Jen?
Hi, I'm just going to share my screen if that's all right. Can you see my screen? So I'm Jen Gobby. Thank you so much for having me. My research is really about social transformation, about building stronger movements, more transformative movements. And I contend that to have movements strong enough to transform systems, they need to be anti-racist, actively anti-racist, which and decolonial, which the current environmental movements that I'm part of are not quite there. So this quote is a quote that's at the beginning of the book based on my thesis. And it's a quote from Ariel Deranger, who runs Indigenous Climate Action, an amazing organization in Canada. So she writes that while the climate justice movement is working hard to address the legacy of white supremacy and colonialism within environmental and conservation movements, it is a work in progress. And she wrote that about the efforts to put forth a new Green Deal, or the Green New Deal in Canada. So this is very recent. So I want to echo here what Kesha was just saying about the environmental movement, definitely North America coming from a very white-centric place. And where, even in the efforts to move beyond that, there's still ways that the movement is really stuck in problematic places. So I want to talk a bit about what I've learned about that in my research. And my research has been very much engaged with the social movements that I'm part of as an activist, but also as a researcher. So the anti-pipeline movements, Indigenous land defense movements, and climate justice movements in Canada. So these are the two outputs of my research that I'm going to be pulling on today when I talk for the next few minutes. So one is a book that's available through Fernwood, and the other one is a summary of the thesis that I produced. It's a PDF, it's free, and it's much quicker to read. So that is available. I can add the link to the PDF in the chat. But moving on, so the book starts with this story of the climate march from 2019 in Montreal, which saw 500,000 people hit the streets. It was a historical moment for climate and environmentalism in Quebec and Canada more broadly. It was huge. But that night, after the march, I got home, I started to find out that actually the march was an incredibly problematic space. I'm going to read a bit from the book here. There's one tweet that came out that night that said, "Montreal climate strike was one of the most racist protest spaces I've ever been in," as a tweet. And then Jessica Bolduc, who is an Anishinaabe French woman from the Michewana First Nation in Northern Ontario, wrote that soon after the march began, non-Indigenous people swarmed behind and to our right, shouting over and silencing the songs of the drummers, all completely ignoring the safe space that we were trying to hold for the youth and for our older relatives. It was at this point that the safety of the community began to be challenged. We held hands, grabbed onto each other's bags, called out for each other. Strategies to stay together. We were pushed, intentionally separated, provoked, and mobbed, all for simply claiming space in this discourse, asking to have Indigenous voices heard and prioritized. She reported that settlers yelled at the youth Indigenous delegation, "It's the People's March, not the Indigenous People's March," and that others said worse. Indigenous youth were confronted with language steeped in hatred and racism. It was from this point on that we would spend the rest of the march struggling simply to stay safe and stay together. So that was at one of the high points of environmentalism in Canada. Indigenous people were targeted with verbal and physical violence. And that came out from many different people at different places in the march. So the Quebec environmental climate movement still has overt racism going on, but racism in the movement is not just coming in overt forms, it also comes in forms of exclusion and erasure. So this here is this plan to get Quebec to a carbon neutral place. It's a 60 or 70 page document that was created this year to move Quebec away from fossil fuels towards renewable energies. And it's a huge document intended to completely inform policy making and the energy transition. And it was drafted by an exclusively white network of environmentalists. At the end of their draft, they approached me and asked, "Hey, could you help us consult Indigenous people on what they think of this document?" Yeah, so their only attempt to get any other perspectives was Indigenous. So they know that they're supposed to consult Indigenous people, but they did it at the very end. I did do my best to get input, and there were, really important feedbacks on the document and suggested changes that now the exclusively white groups are deciding what they want to do with those feedbacks, what they want to keep, what they don't want to keep. So the power dynamic of who's setting the stage, who's creating the agenda, who's setting the policy has not changed. They did empty consultation, much like pipeline and mining companies do. This is the environmental movement in Quebec. In the interviews I did for my doctoral research, I asked people, all the activists and land defenders, the people in the movements that I'm part of, I said, what are the biggest barriers to the change you want to make? And I got different kinds of answers. Some people talk more about external barriers like capitalism, like lack of public will, like corporate influence on the political system. But the most common kind of response to my question about what is the biggest barriers to the change you're trying to make was relational tensions, which was the biggest bar, as you see here. And that was an internal barrier, internal to the movements. And the most common kind of relational tension people brought up was the way that racism, sexism, and other forms of oppression are playing out in our movements, fragmenting, sort of just like tearing apart the social fabric or not allowing the social fabric to develop that is needed to create a strong enough movement of movements to transform our systems. So I wanted to share that. That was a huge finding of my research. So I see that these relations of oppression are continuing to play out in the movement spaces. They happen through instrumentalization. So people trying to be like, oh, let's work with Indigenous people because they have really important rights or really important knowledges. So again, like using Indigenous people to push forward the agenda that is created by the white folk. A common thing happens all the time, asking people to participate. Hey, we have an event next week. Can you come do a land acknowledgement? Can you come speak? As opposed to like creating an event together from the beginning or co-creating, as Kesha said, events and spaces together. A big one is asking, hey, you folks over in that community, would you come and join our climate movement? Well, what about climate activists going to actually support Black Lives Matter marches and show up for them and show up and provide labor for those movements? Like it tends to be the other way around, saying, come join our movement. So there's this, even when collaborations are being formed, there's this difficulty in people learning to share power, or the big NGOs, environmental and climate NGOs, want to keep calling the shots strategically, have trouble really sharing the power, decision-making power, and purse strings. And another thing I heard a lot of in the research was Indigenous folks and other folks of color saying it's very tiring to have to educate wave after wave, generation after generation of white environmental activists about what decolonization or anti-racism means. This is very exhausting. So some of that labor has to be provided by settlers, white folks, to other settlers and white folks. And then another big one that's causing, or another way oppression is playing out, is that there are really conflicting end goals. So in the climate movement, you have people whose end goal is to reduce greenhouse gas emissions, and others whose end goal is the return of indigenous land to indigenous people, like land back, like full-on decolonization. Those are very different goals, and those are people who are working together. But when you see the big strategies and the big campaigns, they tend to be the ones focusing on the end goals of the white folks who are still holding the power. Yeah, and there are this lack of solidarity for people who are doing more diversity of tactics, let's say more conflictual or confrontational tactics. And the white folks are like, hey, that's hurting our chances of reducing greenhouse gas emissions because you're, whatever. So this is another way it's playing out. But I just want to, before I end, say that this kind of dynamics also play out in environmental education, in environmental studies. And I've seen this, my whole education has been in the environmental studies world, and these same things are happening there. This tokenism, which Kesha mentioned, where, oh, we need to get someone of color on that panel. Oh, we need a woman, and so people are brought not because, like, of course they have important knowledge, but they're asked to come to serve a spot as opposed to a more substantive engagement. Asking the same people over, oh, we know this one indigenous person, so we're going to ask them to come to all of our events. That happens over and over again. Build better relations with more people so you're not exhausting the same people over and over again. And then asking people to come and speak about what you want them to speak about, not what they want to speak about or what they're working on. And then these two points are huge with a lot of text, but environmental studies continues to teach the environmental crisis as if it's isolated from racism and capitalism and colonialism. I think there's some places it's getting better, but there's still courses that are not teaching these links, that are teaching environmentalism as something separate. And there are still people, really high up important people in the environmental studies world who still argue that we need to secure a livable planet, and then when we've done that, we can think about racism, sexism, and other problems. I hear this all the time. And this idea that identity politics is the identity politics is the left shooting itself in the foot by trying to do everything. It's showing a huge misunderstanding of the intersecting and interlocked crises and who has power and who gets to make decisions. These forms of social hierarchies are driving the climate crisis. And until we, develop much different social relations that are based on equality, only then will we be able to possibly secure a livable planet. So there's a lot of this going on. And so what's needed is, much more shared analysis, doing a lot more public education and environmental education about the links between all these issues, building better relations of solidarity, unlearning relations of domination, finding new forms of relation, and white folks learning to step aside, which I'm about to do, and making space for others, especially when it comes to decision making. And creating a culture where it's not okay to have all white spaces, all white movements, all white documents, all white panels, or all white teaching teams. And in that, learning genuinely how to share power. And if anyone wants to read any more about my work, the book is 20% off for the rest of the week with that discount code, which I'll add to the chat. And the book is full of other people's voices, the many dozens of people I interviewed, reflecting all these kind of themes. So I'll leave it at that, and thanks for listening.
Thank you so much, Jen, for sharing your experience and thinking on these issues. Next, we'll hear from Ngozi Unuigbe, who's joining us from Nigeria. Ngozi is a researcher at the University of Benin in Nigeria. She's also a member of the steering committee of ELGA. And Ngozi, thanks again for joining us at what I know is a difficult time in your country. So Ngozi, the floor is yours.
Okay, hello everybody. It's actually nice to be here in spite of the emotional drain, which I'm sure you all will expect. As a matter of fact, I'm trying to switch between networks because most of the internet services have been suspended here. Yeah, so just pardon me if there are a little bit of glitches. Okay, so so far I've really enjoyed the conversations, especially in terms of the diverse ways of looking at the relevance of ecological law I have always contemplated the environment as a natural force of nature, right? It's very natural. And so nobody should be deprived of it. You should not favor some people with the environment, neither should you disfavor any group of people with the environment. However, unfortunately, this environment which we speak about is subject to human influences. So that automatically gives rise to environmental classism. I'm very careful about using the term environmental racism because the word racism is a controversial one. To me, in my mind, it would be restricted to race and color, right? So I don't think that's the main problem. I think the problem is the classification and the discrimination when it comes to um, environmental protection. So there's a lot of injustice, and the injustice, the people at the receiving end of this environmental classism are usually minority populations that under normal circumstances will not be able to put up any resistance, right? I talk from the point of view of the Niger Delta people of Nigeria, which I'm going to give you a bit of a picture about in a few minutes. Now, these people cannot put up a resistance because most of the time they have a peasant economy, right? So now the lives, the livelihood, and even the spiritual connection of these people to the land is jeopardized. Now, there are two ways to get out of this problem of environmental classism. Well, normally, there are two significant ways to get out of it. The first one is to enforce the right to information, and the second one is to enforce the right to life, right? As a way of insisting that this has to be done. I mean, that this injustice must stop. Now, what is it about the right to information? The right to information simply says, allow me to make an informed decision about things that would affect the environment. That's why you need free prior informed consent from native people. It is a fundamental and should be a fundamental right. Now, you can't come to my community and carry out oil exploration activities that I know nothing about, that I don't know the extent of the pollution it's going to cause. And at the same time, I'm not allowed to make or contribute to any of the decisions that cover any of these activities. I mean, what could be more unjust? That's for the information aspect. On the right to life aspect, of course, there are a lot of constitutions in the world. I think all constitutions is a fundamental right, the right to life. But the right to a clean and healthy environment is just in not very many constitutions. Now, in some of these constitutions, like the Constitution of Nigeria, it is a derivative right. In other words, it's not a direct fundamental right. You can't come before the court of law and say your right to a clean environment has been infringed. Nothing like that exists. That's why it's derivative, right? But in some other countries, of course, you already have them as enforceable rights, as an enforceable right to a clean environment. So these are ways people can come to contend an infringement of the rights to try to address the problems of environmental classism or injustice. Usually, what countries that do not have a fundamental right to a clean environment do is that they try to contemplate the right to a clean environment as the right to life. In other words, if you do not give me a clean environment, that means you're threatening my life. Of course, this doctrine of harmonious construction has been used many times in India, for example, and even in Nigeria. But the disadvantage of using this doctrine of harmonious construction is that it is subject to the whims and caprices of the judges. It depends on the effectiveness will depend on how radical, allow me to use that word, the judge is, right? So now let's narrow this down to the Niger Delta region of Nigeria. This is my screen. I don't know if it's visible. Okay, so this is the Niger Delta region of Nigeria, and it comprises 9 states. Like I said, it's a very peasant economy, but the significance of this region is that it has a lot of oil deposits, which is what supports the economy of the country, yet it is still a peasant economy. Now, that's a discussion for another day, but for those of us who are familiar with this resource course, the reason is already obvious, why these people remain poor in the midst of plenty.
Ngozi, you might want to
Yes.
do a full presentation, hit the little presentation button at the bottom, and then your presentation will go full screen. It's just on the very bottom. After comments, you'll go, it looks like.
Yeah, I see. Okay, thank you.
Thanks.
Okay, thank you. So the question is, why are these people still poor in the midst of plenty? Of course, it's resource course. Talking about whether they have used or explored the use of the right to information or the use of the right to life. We have a freedom of information bill in Nigeria. That's not strange. Like I keep saying, Nigeria is one of the countries that has one of the most laws I've ever seen. But the problem, of course, is the implementation of these laws. There is a freedom of information bill in Nigeria, and following the provision of that freedom of information bill, with respect to environmental matters, there is an Environmental Impact Assessment Act, which by its very nature should actually be precautionary. So it should be able to prevent certain environmental damage or degradation that will be done to the society. What then is the problem with this act? How come the people are not able to enforce the provisions of this act? It's very simple. The first problem is that the language of the Environmental Impact Assessment report, it comes out after the assessment has been done, is very technical. Apart from it being very technical, all the information about the environmental activity or the activity to be carried out is not reported. So it doesn't have as much detail as it should have. Thirdly, the entire character of the act itself is not precautionary. It's not preventive in any way. So it doesn't prevent any unforeseen damage to the environment. So that rules out the entire preventive nature or precautionary nature that should actually help the environment. So that aspect of the information is out of the way. What about the right to life? Yes, we have a fundamental right to life under the Nigerian Constitution. Like I said, we do have cases where judges have interpreted the right to a clean environment as the right to life. They did that in Bemire and SPDC in 2005. That was the only successful case that was done. But what happened after the case was that, of course, it never went on appeal. And then in the course of that case, the judge made a declaration that, you know what, this particular oil company, come back to us and give us a step-by-step process that you're going to use to stop these degradation activities in this area. Let us say the court gave an ultimatum of 4 weeks. Before the expiration of the 4 weeks, the case file for that particular case got missing, 1, and 2, the judge got transferred. For goodness sake, that spoke loads. And I mean, it's not strange in a country like this where you've had precedents of the judges prioritizing development over environmental protection. That is a very, very serious matter. So that ticks off information, that ticks off the right to life. The question now is, are there not other laws that people can actually take advantage of to prevent this kind of environmental injustice or classism? Of course. We have civil laws, we have criminal laws. The major problems with the civil laws, which you would expect, is the problem of proof. Like I said at the very beginning, these people cannot help themselves. It's difficult for them to resist for many reasons. In this case, like I said, it's a peasant economy. They do not have the means to even start the process at all, let alone begin to prove causation. That's for the civil laws. For the criminal laws, it is either it has a very, very poor deterrent value, or even if it's properly enforced, it is reactive in nature after the deed has been done. Now, one of the major problems in the Niger Delta region, apart from the seismic surveys, apart from the oil gas flaring, is the fact that you have pollution incidents that can hardly be remedied. I show you the next slide. This is an example of what I am referring to. These people are farmers, these people are fishermen. Imagine this is where someone gets his livelihood from, and it's polluted by oil. Where are you going to start remedying this from? Which law are you going to invoke that would remedy this? That is a very, very major problem. Of course, this is like a validation of the first picture. This is obviously a fisherman. I don't know what kind of fish you're going to get from here and who you're going to sell it to. That's one. And then what is quality of water you're going to get from that kind of place. This is gas flaring. Gas has been flaring in the Niger Delta region since oil was discovered in 1956. Count how many years that is and the kind of environmental damage and health problems that those people will be experiencing. This is an example of the seismic activities that go on there and how it is superimposed on the environment and the livelihood of the people. This is what they get in return because they are helpless people, yet they are frustrated and devastated. This is not to justify any kind of violence, of course, but when you have reached your wit's end, that's usually the case. Okay, so what's the solution? That's where ecological law comes in. We need the kind of legal framework that moves things from being reactive to being preventive. How do you secure the integrity of the ecosystem? How do you promote the vital mechanisms of the ecosystem? It is the maintenance, the preservation that is key. That is where the new set of laws, the narrative begins to change. And I want to join my voice with Kesha and Jen. These things can never be done without including these minority populations as stakeholders in making these laws and the policies. They will not work because their eco-literature are things that actually help us in preserving nature better. That's generally my point. My point is, it is time, just using Nigeria as a case study, but this is a general problem, it's a global problem. It is time to begin to shift the narrative. By the way, in Nigeria, it has started happening in bits, steady, but slow but very steady progress towards introducing ecological law, introducing the rights of nature in however way people can make their contributions, they are making them. It's something that should be propagated. It's something that should be encouraged. It's not, like I said, it's not something that we should make the same old mistakes in introducing. These people should be brought to the table. These people should be involved. Every single person that will be affected should be part of the discussion. Sorry, I hope I'm not taking too much time, but thank you very much for listening.
Thank you, Ngozi, for giving us an close look of some things going on in your part of the world. Now we'll hear from Travis Williams. Travis is an environmental sociologist and a professor at Virginia Commonwealth University in Richmond, Virginia. Travis, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Geoff. So I really appreciate being on this panel. Very honored to share this space with all of you. This has been really fascinating and engaging, and also just very satisfying to hear these engagements with both equity, justice, within an ecological context. And so I want to speak to a lot of the things I've already been talking about. And what I'm going to focus on is one initiative that I've been working on here, which is called Racial Ecologies of the South. I wanted to talk some about that, and I'll also kind of interweave some of the work that I've been doing around that, but also just to highlight some of the dynamics that I try to contribute to support, to facilitate. So Racial Ecologies of the South was a series that I launched in part out of frustration. A lot of that frustration had to do with what I really felt was a lot of whiteness in both environmentalism, but also within the scholarly world as well. And I wanted to find ways of using resources that were available at my institution to try to basically funnel them into the community. And so the general approach that I use, so I want to kind of describe kind of where the language of it comes from. And I'm also going to be trying to speak to some of the things that have already been raised. So Racial Ecologies of the South kind of looks at the intersections of what I would call like racialized world making or worlding. And I get that term from Donna Haraway, who's a feminist science studies scholar. And environmentalism with a focus on the American South. And one of the reasons I also want to speak to the very accurate statement that's been made and kind of been reiterated, particularly by folks who are looking at environmentalism in the context of the West or in the context of the Americas, is that it does have kind of this long history of not only whiteness, but white nationalism, even eugenic undertones. And so I want to talk some about the type of racial work that I try to contribute to with these series, and how we try in the way that they're structured to try to think about ideas, problems, et cetera, of ecology with ideas, problems, et cetera, of race, racism, racialization, white supremacy. So the term that I use, the racial ecologies term, I initially had called the series racialized ecologies, but I also discovered along the way work being done by Leilani Nishimi at University of Washington and Kim D. Hester at Sonoma State University, who had released a book in 2018 called Racial Ecologies, which they describe as the interrelation of race and environmentalism through the interdisciplinary and activist traditions of ethnic studies. So that's a lot of what informs my approach. So what in terms of the things that I've worked on in this context of racialized ecologies, first I want to kind of just contextualize myself, what I spend a lot of time doing. So I work, and because I focus also on pedagogy and education, I want to kind of locate myself in that larger system as well. So I met Virginia Commonwealth University, and I'm actually a teaching faculty, which means a lot of my labor is focused on teaching, classrooms, et cetera. I have a very heavy student load. A lot of the research and so on that I do is sort of on my own time. But I wanted to talk about that because one of the goals of the series that I've done is to really try to lift up and platform voices from the margins. And I try to really emphasize intersectionally marginalized people, in particular women of color. Black and Indigenous women have really been at the forefront of this. I mean, I helped organize the event, and I sort of structured it and came up with it, but my goal has really been to provide platforms for marginalized voices. And when I do that, I'm trying to pay attention to kind of some specific things. So when I approach that particular arena, I'm really trying to focus on like there are four big themes of it. So one is the Black radical tradition, going back to Cedric James and kind of black critical thought, black sociology, racial capitalism, things like that. Experiential learning and critical pedagogy. So people like Paulo Freire, who wrote the really well known book, Pedagogy of the Oppressed, and more recently, my colleague Eli Meyerhoff, who's at Duke University. He's actually just a visiting scholar there. He's also kind of what you would describe as kind of working within the realm of kind of the academic precariat. So he has a job down there, but also it's still subject to those same forces as all of our education systems are, of neoliberal capitalism, the retreat of state funding, things like that. I also try to focus a lot on expert knowledge from the margins. So really being active in trying to look at work, research, et cetera, that is being done on the margins, not just in terms of being outside of academia or even with an activist bent, but a lot of the speakers that I try to bring, first of all, they're generally organizers. So in these spaces, I don't generally have, I have academics join the space, but they're there for dialogue. It's not really an academic led space. I try to focus on the knowledge and expertise and skills that organizers on the ground bring and try to support them in whatever way I can. And even in those events, I also try to decenter myself as well, as much as I can, because I really am very interested in not only the idea of kind of showcasing struggles and marginalized identities, but also really recognizing multiple sources of knowledge and expertise, and that's really important to me. And the last one is the kind of major topic of it is land, heritage, and environmental justice. And so I had done this for probably the last 3 years. The third installation, which was the theme of the third installation, was Black and Indigenous voices. That particular one, even though it had a lot of people who had already been working with, that kind of got postponed because of COVID, but that will be happening in the spring. So one of the things, because we've been talking a lot about kind of race and difference and things like that, and I'm using the term racial ecologies. One of the things that I think is really important, and I think it's been emphasized here, is to kind of understand the situatedness of different kind of race, class, difference, identity relations. So in the US, a lot of the race relations here are deeply shaped by histories of colonialism, of chattel slavery, and of generally institutionalized white supremacy, which continues to be a very dominating force today. And so one of my kind of points of departure when I try to think and talk about race, and I'm also trying to think about this in the context of ecological law, how do we include people in these ecology-centered discourses, which traditionally we often have seen a divergence between kind of human-centered discourse and ecology-centered discourses, and people getting excluded and things like that. So I try to think of racialization and race as an expansive concept, and many people have said that before. One of the main places that I had gotten that was actually from the work of Toni Morrison, the fiction writer, and the way that the worlds that she built in her literature, these worlds that were not so much simply focused on like Blackness as a minority slice, but really as a whole way of thinking about the world. And so one of my big emphases is on thinking about race as an expansive concept, so that race is not just the idea of kind of like phenotype bodies, but race has to do with our knowledge systems, our history, our identities, the public narratives that get shared and entrenched. And so I try to kind of push against the idea of race as reductive, but really trying to understand the way we even think about difference, the way we even the three pillars of sociology, race, class, and gender, et cetera. A lot of my approach to this expansive viewpoint is also informed by Charles Mills, who wrote The Racial Contract, and a lot of that was about how, particularly in the West, the development of law, legal systems, systems that were guaranteeing people civil liberties, things like that, were always racialized from the beginning, and that there was a lot of the white supremacy, not necessarily saying it or labeling it explicitly, but that it is literally the fabric of a lot of our social institutions. And even like James Baldwin kind of famously said in his speech at Berkeley, he was like, American institutions generally are racist institutions. He made that as a kind of a blanket statement. So I think part of the work that needs to be done, and that I try to contribute to, because again, I don't come as a single, I have the solutions to things. I agree, or I'm in a similar line of what Kesha opened up with in terms of coming with questions and ways of thinking and re-articulating our problems. So in those events around racial ecologies that I organize, I not only try to kind of reach out to communities. When I say reach out, these are also people who I've really gotten to know. For a lot of them, I won't even approach someone unless they know me, I know them. We've kind of interacted with each other. I try to kind of avoid making anyone feel like they're just sort of like a targeted object or anything. That was just something that can happen even unintentionally. And so when I try to seek out expert voices from the margins, I also emphasize expert voices, not just expertise. It's not just things you can kind of go get and then sell and distribute and so on, but really a situated, lived voice that has experiences, that has a perspective, that has a certain standpoint and a certain biography. And so a lot of the folks that I work with, which are disproportionately Black and Indigenous women, a lot of them not only will talk about kind of their struggles and strategies and the type of work they do in the world in general, but also specific to the environmental world. So a lot of the folks that I worked with experienced all kinds of racism and marginalization in the environmental communities. And because I've always try to think about, I try to think about things intersectionally. So looking at racialized worlds, not just the idea that race exists in a certain dimension, but the people that I try to reach out to, the people who I work with, they speak from a perspective of being not just marginalized by dominant society, but also within, movements like the environmental movement that may be thought of as on the surface level progressive. But as you already heard, and as many of us already know, there are deep histories of whiteness, of white nationalism, of eugenics, et cetera, associated with environmentalism. And the big focus is that these people who I also look at as teaching me, as in a space to learn themselves as well, are their experiences are very intersectional. So a lot of the struggles that they talk about is not just kind of like, race in terms of race in the United States, but also looking at racialized spaces, at racialized identities, at even hierarchies that can occur within racialized groups, and the way that white supremacy can traverse all kinds of bodies. And so the value of the knowledge, because a lot of my focus is on public knowledge, whether it be people who are doing community health surveys to try to make visible communities that have been erased by more official state surveys, or people whose knowledge has either been denigrated or downplayed because maybe they don't have certain degrees, or they're in an environmental organization where like everyone has a master's, or they've gone to a certain type of school. And so some of my best teachers are people who have really learned to navigate these spaces. And there are folks that when I encounter them, or when I see people really working in the community, I try to find folks who I know and who have experiences that will resonate with marginalized voices in all senses of the term, not just in terms of being not academic, or not just in terms of being an activist, but also recognizing the hierarchies that exist within those spaces. And essentially, it's really about having a space of dialogue where people can bring their experiences, their knowledge, et cetera. And I really, I give the platform to the speakers. They may say things that I don't agree with. I've had, like there was one interaction where one of the speakers who was participating, she was talking about her views based on medical racism that she had experienced, and how that affected her viewpoints on everything from women's bodies. She had certain views about vaccines, etc. And there were several times where people would try to kind of intervene and kind of try to prevent her from talking because she wasn't delivering a certain message, or she was delivering a message which maybe seemed controversial. And I really emphasized the way that I was not really willing to go in and try to like police what she was saying, because she was speaking from a certain experience. And I think I think it's really important that we actually open up spaces to confront problems and not just avoid them. So when I'm thinking about racial ecologies and environmental law and this desire to kind of be more inclusive, I think a really important component of it is to, for one, recognize, and I'm not saying this is not already happening, but to be really intentional. That's one thing that I've also learned from folks in the community that I've worked with. They speak a lot about intentionality, not just sort of engaging in actions, but really what kind of, what intentions do you actually bring? What is your actual goal? Are you in solidarity with the group? Do they just seem like, you know, something good to showcase? Do you need like a diversity event or something like that? Because I think those little things like that matter. And so by taking resources from wherever they may be, like in my case, a university, I really try to distribute those in the community. And when I invite people, I really allow them to take that space themselves. I don't assume that I necessarily know more than the speaker that's coming. I don't necessarily try to, you know, program them too much. And we've had really good feedback and really good experiences with this. And it's also been really good for students as well. It's one thing, for example, if you read about, oh yeah, Indigenous women were sterilized in the US up until very recently, and there's still ongoing cases, even in places like Saskatchewan, when they can actually hear from people who've lived those. And so like I've had women who speak about their experiences of sterilization, they'll speak about their experiences of racism, but also they bring knowledge, and they bring really open-minded viewpoints, and they make real contributions to the problems that are being worked on at all levels. But one of the main things that I kind of want to emphasize with this idea of expansiveness is that when we think about whiteness, when we think about race, racial difference, it's really important, I think, to think about it in an expansive sort of way, and also to recognize, as I think is also on display here with our really awesome, like diverse, kind of transnationally focused panel, is that location matters, histories matter, getting to understand the context of the problems that we are dealing with. And I know there was also a comment about you know, the left is shooting itself in the foot when it gets lost in identity politics, and this was a big discussion that I've been having with my students for the last week or so, in part because if you look at the history of social movements, so many powerful social movements have been disintegrated and disrupted by these very differences that continue to be marginalized in the academy. And I know I had one, not just in the academy, but also in activist spaces in general, in these environmental spaces. And another experience I wanted to mention was even recently there was a gathering of an environmental sociologist, it was a couple years ago, and they had been kind of doing work, distributing surveys on like race and racism, because it's unsurprisingly, it's a very white segment of the American Sociological Association. And one of the responses, there was actually a lot of pushback to it in responses, people who felt that it wasn't their problem, that there was also racism elsewhere, and can't they talk about this in the race and ethnicity section? So I think bringing those two dialogues together, dialogues around ecology, dialogues around race or racism or difference of whatever kind, I think to think about them together is very important versus looking at one of them as like an add-on. I also think something that's already been mentioned by our speakers, the importance of process, bringing people in early so that the actual production of, whether it's problem solving, whether it's events, space sharing, dialogue, action planning, so that people are there from the beginning. I think that's really important. So I don't want to rant too much. I can expand on anything I've touched upon, but I kind of just wanted to talk a little bit about the Racial Ecologies of the South series that I had worked on, and why I felt like a lot of what folks were saying today was very helpful to me. And also I saw a lot of intersections in the concerns that we all seem to share about positive ecological change, but also how to avoid some of the pitfalls that have been reproduced over and over again in environmental spaces. So I'll leave it at that.
Thank you very much, Travis. And I want to move now to the next part of the webinar, which is really to let the four of you exchange some ideas, comment on what you've heard from each other, pose some questions to each other, questions that are on your mind that maybe all of you could think about that build on what we've heard so far. I think we can maybe start with Kesha, who went first on the first time, and just let it go from there. I'll let you comment as you feel drawn in. To those listening, I invite you once again to write your comments or questions in the chat. We won't have time to hand you the mic, but we will check the chat and bring up some of those questions and observations before we end the webinar today. So Kesha, if you want to start this next round of sort of dialogue among the four of you, please go ahead.
Okay, so Jen spoke about, I tried to write it down, different goals around climate change. And I thought about, in my research, the different goals, and it might touch on some of what Ngozi said, that when I look at the environmental justice movement in the USA and a discussion of environmental racism, and I will continue to use racism. It is the language that they use because there is a correlation between race, ethnicity, and where hazardous or polluting industries are located in the USA. And research has shown that it's very much, racism very much an indicator of that. So I will continue to use racism here. And I was asked this question in my defense. I used the framework of environmental racism. And yes, it applies, especially if you're looking at the history of toxic waste dumping within the continent of the US itself. But in Ghana, I couldn't use environmental racism. It became something more around environmental justice or injustice. I wouldn't use classism because I just went to Google it, and I'm not very comfortable with the definition and its applicability to my research site. And I say I use injustice because in Ghana, ethnicity, not so much class, was a determinant on who was involved in that sort of hazardous waste work. So again, it was northern ethnicities living in your urban slums that was doing that work. Now, in the US, you see that a lot of these communities who were fighting or who are behind this environmental justice movement have the protection of the environment, the places where they live, work, and play at the forefront. We want to protect this from toxic waste dumping, from affecting our health. But then when I go to my research site and the communities that I was researching, it wasn't the environment. It was, this is a survivalist strategy. I cannot prioritize the environment, or they cannot prioritize the environment, so much so when they cannot meet their basic needs, all right? Food, shelter, clothing. So that was always at the forefront. So if you're coming with a law like, before I go there, I think, so if we broaden it and we look at, I remember this thing about the 7 billion people at the base of the pyramid, right? If these 7 billion people at the base of the pyramid are totally focused on meeting their basic needs, how do you create any sort of law that allows them to do that? If And I say that because at the end of the day, what is most important? I need to meet my basic needs. I don't think any of my research participants want to pollute the environment. I don't think they like the environment that they're living in, but everybody has to make a priority. So unless we deal with the global inequities, unless we tackle poverty, unless we tackle a lot of these social issues, this idea of ecological law or bringing a somewhat of a maintaining ecological integrity will always be, it can happen in certain places, but it will not happen in others. If the status quo remains, I'm not sure if you follow me. So my basic point is, if I am hungry, I might not be interested in serving the environment. I will use the environment as a source of food all the time. And even if that means that gradually, as I use it as a source of food, as a source of livelihood, that I am destroying it. So that was just it, just to show that in different spaces, their requirements, their priorities are different. And this is one of the pushbacks of a lot of environmental thinkers, is that people of color are not concerned about the environment. I cannot be concerned about the environment if I cannot meet my basic needs, right? So it's how do we come to balance these two needs? And I think I addressed to some extent. I had a question for Ngozi. I hope I'm pronouncing your name right. Do you think that the degree of contamination that you showed in your pictures would be possible in other advanced countries? Because you talked about environmental classism. And I just wonder that degree of pollution and the lack of accountability for foreign firms, foreign firms involved in the petroleum industry in the Niger Delta, would it be possible in other locations? And is environmental classism the right sort of concept to talk about it? These are my questions, or my thoughts, or my ramblings, I should say.
Thank you so much, Kesha. And while that question is fresh, why don't we turn now to Ngozi to respond and to share any other thoughts or questions she has for the others.
Okay, thank you, Kesha, for those questions. In terms of, let me start with the level of contamination in other countries, Western countries, for example. The fact that there's so much wanton degradation of the environment in the Niger Delta doesn't mean that it is a localized problem or is a problem that is peculiar to the Niger Delta region of Nigeria. Of course, we have examples from the Amazon and other examples of oil pollution in other parts of the world, and how these have been handled. These are common problems, how people who can usually not help themselves are faced with this level of degradation that they can hardly challenge and sometimes maybe even have to live with. Of course, we have them in several degrees all over the world. Now, the reason why I have used the term environmental classism, of course, it's a kind of environmental injustice. Environmental racism is also environmental injustice. But the reason why I've used environmental classism for the Niger Delta region of Nigeria is because these people cannot as much as afford a lawyer. The laws are there. They are aware that the laws are there. They are aware that they can take advantage of these laws to protect themselves, but they cannot make any move because they do not have the means to, even with the legal aid that exists in Nigeria. The environmental pollution still continues in spite of this. Now, there's no other deduction or no other conclusion that you can attribute to that kind of thing, apart from the fact that it is because these people cannot help themselves. Now, if you look at one of the synonyms of environmental classism, it simply means, it simply puts it within the realm of fairness. So as far as I'm concerned, whether we use the word injustice, we use the word discrimination, we use the word racism, or whatever we use, it's still born out of the ideology of unfairness. But for the Niger Delta region of Nigeria, like I said, why I have used classism is because these people are in a very, very low class, economically, and they cannot help themselves. That's why. So it's actually specifically used because of the context. Okay, sorry. I was going to ask Jen a question about how do you involve vulnerable groups in executing climate justice? In Nigeria, for instance, I see that when we talk about climate justice, it's usually the government coming down with policies and making it look like some work is being done to implement climate justice or to promote climate justice in the country. And we don't hear the voices of these vulnerable groups, women, disabled people, poor people and all of that. So has it worked anywhere? Have you deployed any methods that have worked? Is there anything we can learn from?
It's a great one, great question. So what I've seen going on is that the people who are tending to come up with these sort of policy ideas or these kind of the Green New Deal or these energy transition plans or these kind of things tend to be large NGOs or coalition of NGOs, and these folks have decent funds. A lot of them have CEOs that are paid a lot of money per year. There's money in the movements, but then when it comes down to the time when they're like, oh, we need to make sure our document or a proposal for climate justice reflects the lived experiences or the perspectives of people who are most impacted. Then they're like, oh, we don't have the budget, so let's just invite them to come on their own time. And then those people are struggling to just get by. Those communities are struggling with other issues and don't have the time to just come and sit at the table. So they end up often those visions do not represent. So what we've been trying to do here in Quebec, for example, is just I've been pushing for a couple of years for this culture change that anytime you ask an Indigenous or a person of color for their time in a white dominated space, you pay them honorariums, usually at around $100 an hour. And this is happening more and more, so we're finding creative ways to funnel money that exists in NGOs, like environmental organizations, or money that exists in research areas like our own. Find ways to funnel money to remunerate people to offer their time and their insight and their knowledge and their perspectives to come to white dominated tables and share. So that's like our first start, is like creative ways to provide the support, funding support they need to be present at the table. Another one is actually going and actively helping with their struggles. So right now there's a bunch of struggles around land violation of Indigenous rights and theft of land around Canada. And so a lot of it, the environmentalists who are trying to do this work well are going to support those groups to be on the territories or to funnel funds towards those struggles. And so actively, when environmental groups actively concretely help support those struggles, then next time you're saying, hey, can you give me your perspective on what kind of policies we should be proposing to the Quebec government about carbon neutrality, then all of a sudden there's actually relations of reciprocity and accountability already developed, and then so that really helps. But yeah, like this push to remunerate people or find some sort of reciprocity, and second, this culture change towards not just being like, well, we tried to consult people, they didn't come to the table, so we're just going to go forward with this document as is. But saying, no, actually, that's not okay. It's not okay to put forward a policy created by all white group of people, because A, it's wrong, and B, it's not going to work. That plan is fundamentally flawed from the outset. So trying to push this, and it's at different stages, but I mean, there's been some amazing work going on in other parts of Canada. There's this organization, Indigenous Climate Action, and right now they're working on a project that I'm supporting that is developing Indigenous-led climate policy where Indigenous folks are at their own table, creating their own policies, and then putting that forward. And that is helping, being funded by funneling money through research, through NGOs that want to be supportive. So I just want to share that, yeah, there's many different approaches, but I think finding ways for those people who want to bring those perspectives to the table to have to offer something in return. And yeah, I'll stop there. Thanks for the question.
Great. Jen, did you want to add anything else based on what you heard from the other panelists, or?
I can ask a question, sure. I wanted to ask Travis a bit about how you're finding, like, are your students, you have students who are up and coming in the environmental field?
I mean, I work with a lot of undergraduate,
okay,
with a lot of undergraduate students. Maybe be more like specific. I mean, I teach in the sociology department.
Okay. Sociology,
okay. Like a lot of different students. But,
I'm just curious if you're seeing a shift in what the environmental sociology world is looking like with the new generation of young folks up and coming, if that's seeming like to be a transformative moment.
I think there is a shift going on. One thing that has happened is kind of the mainstreaming of environmental justice and environmental justice studies. It had kind of emerged more on the margins, sort of as a response to the whiteness of the environmental movement, and also justice and race questions that seem to be marginalized within environmental sociology that was coming out in the 80s. But I think there are more I think one of the things I'm noticing with my students is more of an awareness of intersectionality, like they kind of understand it even before I really tell them. And I think particularly with just the state of the world, they're always talking about problems in relation to one another. And it's almost impossible to ignore the way in which they're sort of interweaved with each other today, because there is so much, there's so much visible that is now. And I also think that feminists have made a really big impact as well on environmental knowledge making, environmental scholarship. I think that's also something that was marginalized for a while. And I think there's always been a really rich overlap between ethnic studies and feminist studies. And in addition to just the environmental field, needing to reckon with race and stuff like that, there's also recognition in the racial studies, ethnic studies, sociology, anthropology, cultural studies of race and racism, that you can't really ignore ecology, that part of the lived histories, experiences, part of racialization in the way that inequality is generated, the way that identities are formed, does involve an ecological dimension. And I'm thinking a lot of the work too of Carolyn Finney and her work on kind of African Americans, the environmental experience, and how she questions this idea both in terms of African Americans being separate from the environment, or not really engaging in it, or seeing themselves as woven into it. Like someone had already, I can't remember who had spoken about it. I think it might have been Kesha, who was talking about who has people's hierarchy of needs and their concerns and things like that. If you look also just at racialized experiences, a lot of the relationship between, like, say, African Americans for existence in the environment also has to do with their relationship to the land, and whether or not they were actually, what did the countryside or wooded areas mean, like in the antebellum period. I think there's a lot of history students that are getting more into these intersections. And I think that both on the side of race and ethnicity scholarship and environmental scholarship, I think there's kind of more of a realization that the two sort of need each other in order to really give more robust accountings of the world that we live in. If you're talking about racism and racial injustice, it's so necessary to also recognize those ecological dimensions. Talking about environment, as we've been talking about a lot, it's really important to recognize the racial dimensions. And I do see that. I see more of it, and I really think the mainstreaming or the more popularization of environmental justice, even though that can also be a kind of containing and limiting in its own way sometimes, I do think it has opened up a lot more dialogue and discussion about these race ecology intersections with stuff like racial ecologies, which, like I said, was also being really developed out in Washington area, but also with things like Black ecology as well. I think that there's more of these intersectional fields that are emerging, and I think that of my students, I think they're also, at least compared to last, I would say like 3 or 4 years, there's more, at least where I am. I know this could be context specific, but in terms of activism influencing students, I think that also is not just kind of an abstractly valuable experience, but it's really helpful for their learning as well, because they don't experience these issues as being separate when they can kind of see them in the movement. Like even with environmental students that I've worked with, when they work around here, they have to know immediately, oh wow, there's some racial issues that are here. Because if you actually go out and you listen to people, you hear those things. So even before, rather than even me having to kind of introduce them to students, like, okay, you've been in this white environmental world, I think as they're more publicly exposed, they see a lot of those issues. A lot of it will vary depending on what community that you're in, but I think in general, I am seeing changes. And I also think the field of ethnic studies has been pushing environmental sociology more as well, because there's been a huge expansion of ecology studies coming out of ethnic studies.
Okay, thank you, Travis. I want to bring in some questions that that have shown up in the chat, and there's a couple that deal with rights of nature, and I want to focus on these because rights of nature is sometimes seen as the most active area of what we're thinking of ecological law. It actually has some feet on the ground with the recognition of rights of nature, for example, in the Wanganui River in New Zealand and other places. So we have two questions here and they're related. So one person asks, notes that there's a charter amendment in Orange County, Florida, that proposes to grant a right to clean water only for county residents who are citizens that have legal residence there. And so the question related to that, is rights of nature going to become another policy concept for reproducing colonialism, like wilderness and other environmental ideas have been? And the related question is you mentioned, and this is, I guess, focused mostly to Kesha, you mentioned that within the ecological movement, often ideas of indigenous people, Black people, and people of color are colonized and resold to them. How do you feel the rights of nature movement fits in with this, and how can this colonizing and reselling be prevented? And she also notes that that the concept of legal personhood is seen by some people as an approximation within colonial systems of law for representing indigenous worldviews. So I invite any of you to comment on that.
Okay, so I'm going to go with Lindsay's first question. And my response is not an academic question, because I have not really gone in depth on this whole rights to nature movement. But every time I hear rights, I feel like rights can be given and rights can be taken away. I don't know, it's just a visceral reaction to the word rights. And who confers that right? And so that is my question around rights. And when you say the thing, you mentioned Orange County, there again, I look at rights almost like as a legal instrument, and how certain groups of people who may be perceived as not having full membership within the state can be excluded from the benefits of various ecosystem services like clean fresh water, all right? And how do we ensure that when we talk about these rights, the rights to nature, but also how it's tied to, because I don't think you can talk about the rights to nature and not talk about human rights if we see ourselves as deeply embedded within nature itself and that we are not separate, right? If that's what we see, how do you separate it? And so you cannot confer rights to nature without conferring rights to humanity, to everybody else. But I've always had an issue with the rights framework. I'm not sure if it's the wording that bothers me, but I think if we are not careful, it can be used as another tool of repression, oppression, exclusion, etc. So that's basically what I can say about that. And then there was a question about international waste and resource extraction. So around electronic waste recycling, you have the Basel Convention, and there's been a lot of critique about it in terms of the loopholes that it has, in terms of the fact that it has very little teeth, that countries are not obligated to ratify to it, nor do they need to be signatories. Like the US, is it a signatory yet? It has not ratified it, or something of the sort. So the US produces a massive amount of electronic waste, but it has not signed on fully to the Basel Convention. So it allows its waste to be traded with other countries. So I find that in a lot of international law, if it doesn't have teeth, if it doesn't have legal backing, if there are no real punitive measures to hold different countries accountable, then what is the point? And that is some of the questions with the Basel Convention. And so you have the Basel Convention, you have regional ones like the Bamako Convention, again, which is a lot of African countries are part of this, but yet even Ghana has not fully ratified that convention, right? So all of these sorts of broad or large sort of laws, we need a new way of thinking about them. And if we cannot hold countries truly accountable, then they just become these conventions, these treaties that do not really, cannot go all the way in remediating some of the problems that they were designed to fix.
Well, Kesha, thank you. Let me
thank you.
Prevent time. And I just want to go to the rest of the panel with, if you want to make any comments about these questions about the rights of nature movement or the effectiveness of international law or laws in addressing some of the justice issues we've been talking about today, or any other closing thoughts you may have as we bring this webinar to a close. So Ngozi, let me turn to you.
Okay, I'm not quite sure why that particular rights of nature law has come out that way, maybe because I don't have the context to it, but if I take it on the face of it, I think that's treading on dangerous ground here. It means that, I mean, we're just reinventing the wheel, if you ask me. I don't think anything has changed, and things might even get worse with this kind of thing. That's for it. Then for the international treaties and enforcement, it's the nature of international treaties not to impose sanctions on countries. They leave it to the countries to be able to implement the provisions of the treaties as they deem fit. But then you have an obligation under the treaty to obey the provisions of that treaty. The question is, when you do not obey the provisions of the treaty, what happens? That's the problem with international law. So the worst anybody can do on the international level is for statements to be made, naming and shaming and all of that. So the responsibility still lies with the countries to enforce their laws. That's why they're ratifying the laws. That's why they're signatories to the laws. So they have a responsibility and they must fulfill that responsibility. Thanks.
Thank you, Ngozi. Jen, do you have anything to add?
Sure, just quickly about the rights of nature thing. I just, and about the international law thing, both, I guess, the only things that come up is that, I mean, there's so many things, like so many human rights that are constantly violated all over the world all the time. And those are things that are already in law and already affirmed. So what would make this different? And then if you're asking, okay, well, we need more enforcement of human rights, we need more enforcement of rights for nature, then you start having the strengthening of state power, which, at least from the perspective of Indigenous communities in Canada, strengthening state power is not a great idea. Strengthening their rights to care and take care of their own sovereignty, actually. Anything that supports their own sovereignty is great. Is great in terms of taking care of the ecosystems and the lands and waters. But anything that is strengthening state power is a little bit, you got to think about the possible unintended consequences to marginalized people. That's all. Thanks.
Nice point, Jen. Thank you. And Travis, your closing thoughts before we end the webinar. We need you to unmute, please.
Do you want me to comment specifically on the rights of nature? Was that the? I want to make sure I'm commenting.
Well, I sort of, because we're running out of time, I just want to give you sort of the floor to talk about either the rights of nature, the power of states, or any other closing thoughts you might have.
Sure. Well, for one, I'm really grateful that I was able to participate on this. Thanks for inviting me. I think spaces like this are really valuable. I think especially emphasizing the importance of transnational dialogue, transnational collaboration. I know that might not have been like the most explicitly emphasized thing, but that's something that I find really refreshing. And I think particularly here in the US, when you look at a lot of the failings at the level of the federal government, I think it's more important than ever for folks to continue to organize in other ways and to make use of the resources that they have. In terms of the rights of nature, I think it is one of those things where it's kind of a slippery path. I think that there is a tremendous amount of knowledge that has come out of indigenous communities in terms of indigenous studies and indigenous experts that I often turn to when I'm trying to understand about how to think about these things together in terms of how to think about social structures, laws, legal systems, institutions, and also ecology, because I think one of the vestiges of the colonial legacy is the certain types of separation and compartmentalization. And I think as has been happening across the board in many different fields, I think there's a recognition that indigenous knowledge isn't just like interesting or kind of thought-provoking, but that it's very useful for grappling with a lot of the problems that we see today, which really require a lot of integration of multiple modes of thinking that may be nuanced in a certain way, but also have traditions that go back thousands of years in terms of not separating these things. I mean, even in the US, the origins of our democratic system was with the Iroquois Confederacy. So I think recognizing a lot of the things that already are out there is part of the work that everyone is doing in terms of those marginalized voices, perspectives, histories, etc. So I'll end on that.
Great, thanks, Travis. And you're speaking my mind on those closing thoughts. They're excellent thoughts to close on today. I want to thank Kesha, Ngozi, Jen, and Travis for offering their time and their ideas today. It's been a really great discussion. So thank you so much. I want to remind everybody we have 2 more webinars in this year's series. On November 7th, the topic will be Imagining and Realizing Cities for the Common Good. And on December 15th, the topic will be Ecological Sustainable Development Goals. So please join us for those. And again, thanks to all of you for joining us and for our panelists for some really good dialogue. Take care, everybody.
Thanks.